Hello, I think it's time to make a start for the session. My name is Paulette Wallace and I am a member of the Our Common Dignity Rights-Based Approaches Working Group. Now, before we begin the webinar proper, we have some quick announcements to make, mainly in relation to the technical undertaking of this Zoom. Now, it's 2021 and we're all relatively familiar with Zoom, but please enter your full real name and also please mute your microphone. And you can also switch off your video just to lessen disruptions during the webinar. We would really like to receive your questions and comments, so please feel free to type them into the chat in whatever language is comfortable for you. And there will be time at the end of the webinar for addressing questions and comments. And the moderators may also have question time earlier after presenters throughout the presentation also. Please note that all questions and comments from today's webinar will be collated by our Common Dignity Rights-Based Approaches Working Group. And please note that this webinar is being broadcast on Facebook Live, and also the video recording will be available on the ICOMOS YouTube at some point in the future. Now, we want to know what you thought about our webinar. So everyone who fills in our evaluation poll or exit poll will go in the draw to win an ebook about people-centered methodologies for heritage conservation. And so you'll receive, or you can see, the link to our evaluation poll, and that will be posted in the Zoom chat throughout this webinar. So just keep an eye out, and when you have a moment, please go in and fill out our questions. And that is the completion for me. And great.
Yeah. Good day from also the moderators of the event. And we are slightly going through the agenda. We are going to have we are going to follow the line of Heritage Thursdays, so that we start with small introduction and the news related to rights-based approaches activities. And then we will have our 4 presentations from very well-known experts. And we end up with some questions and answers and closing and discussion, and that's it. The seminar will take altogether 1 hour and 45 minutes. Today's event is moderated by Gronya Shafri, please.
Good morning, everybody, and lovely to see you all here.
Yeah. And Gronya is from Ireland, and she is the member of ICOMOS board. And my name is Riina Alatalu, and I'm ICOMOS Vice President for Europe, and I come from Estonia. So lovely to meet you all.
Indeed, yeah. I will just say a couple of words, and what we have here is the resolution 19, I think it was, adopted at the General Assembly last year in 2020. And this resolution was notable because it was a joint initiative of the ICOMOS working groups, national committees, international scientific committees, and 88 members. So it had a very strong and broad support base. And it is, in a sense, Heritage Thursdays are an action of this resolution, which focused on people-centered approaches to cultural heritage. And we've just flagged one part of that resolution, which is important to read, but just that within it, it resolves to support and seek to expand continuing cooperation of all the various committees with the shared objectives of sustainable development, climate change action, cultural diversity, human rights-based approaches and the diverse forms of Indigenous cultural heritage. And further, to integrate the focus of that work into ICOMOS's theoretical and conceptual frameworks, which are in a sense our documents, which is in a way the focus of this particular theme, this particular webinar on inspirational documents. So the resolution sets the scene for the Heritage Thursday webinar series, but it even more focuses our attention today on our theme, inspirational documents. Reen, I think we'll move to the news now, and we'll come back to our theme. That's just to kind of put it in context.
And the news are facilitated to us by Ave Paulus, ICOMOS Estonia president, and Adriana Carriaga, a member of ICOMOS board from Uruguay. Please, Ave, first.
Hello, everyone. I'm so glad that there are 33 of us in Zoom and more in Facebook Live watching. So thank you for having me, and exactly on these inspirational documents. One ICOMOS scientific conference was held in September 13-14 in Florence, Italy. Doctrinal text achievements, importance and future in the protection of heritage on the 19th anniversary of the Athens Charter. And me, Benedict, Bente, Clara Arcasiami, Gronia, Laura Robinson held a lecture there on the relevance of human rights-based approach in doctrinal text and practice of cultural heritage conservation, where we explained the shift from heritage law to right to heritage, and briefly discussed ICOMOS text to remember, Stockholm and Buenos Aires declarations marking the 50th and 17th anniversaries of human rights and people-centered approaches, as well to as to our inputs to World Heritage Operational Guidelines 2019. And quality principles and input to guidance for impact assessments, as well as to cultural rights and climate change, United Nations Special Report and COVID-19 report. And thought about develop further these rights-based approaches in 3 concrete cases dealing with a UNESCO heritage site of city-to-city network in Mozambique and Bergen, and in the case of Finno-Ugric peoples, nature use and cultural rights, and a specific case of specific house and the Voices of Past of 14 Henrietta Street, Dublin. Next slide, please. And some news to come. We welcome you on our next heritage, specifically dealing with coastal heritage and coastal communities, as last year's United Nations report specifically mentioned that these are most vulnerable heritage as to climate change that we are having. At the same time, they have always dealt with climate and changing climate. So it is an asset too. So 25th of November, we have a webinar on community rights and coastal heritage that is dedicated to the interrelations between communities, heritage and climate change on the example of coastal communities, themes, traditional communities, indigenous peoples, UNESCO sites, conflicting histories, climate resilience, coastal landscape challenges and changes. We welcome contributions. We are seeking for presentations. Please contact me. And the picture, actually the map shows one of such huge area of coastal landscapes of actually Norway, Lofoten to Bergen, so from 16th century. So next slide, please. And in the beginning of December, we welcome guests in hybrid workshop. We are planning to have 10-20 guests in Estonia, coastal heritage, community rights and climate resilience. We are having now already third year workshops on community rights and specific heritage. And this time, together with Estonian Academy UNESCO chair, can I name it, yeah, Riin? And ICOMOS Estonia, we welcome all people from Europe and world to take part in it. The call will open soon. Coastal heritage, tangible and intangible, movable and movable landscapes and spaces, cultural spaces and cultural environments that actually Faro Convention also centers on, and land and water. And the rights, practices, livelihoods, ownership, existence of coastal communities and coastal climate logic embedded in traditional knowledge on climate challenges and loss, resilience and resistance. So these are brief news that.
Thank you. Thank you. Very short notice on a global workshop, student workshop that took place in internet and provided by Estonian Academy of Arts on the heritage alerts and the advocacy, because heritage alerts are one of the flagship initiatives of ICOMOS to remind people on the danger to heritage. And the summer school was dedicated to test the efficiency of heritage alerts, and it provides, the results provide now a platform for further discussions with local stakeholders and their interest in this process. The other news is about the urban agenda activities of EU, which is run mostly by the initiative of Federal Institute for Research on Building, Urban Affairs and Spatial Developments of Germany. And it is dedicated to the dissonant heritage. And the dissonant heritage in this case is mostly taken as, it's mostly dedicated to the heritage of totalitarian regimes. And this is an issue that deeply, especially the heritage from last half a century or 1 century, it deeply reflects and influences the mind of people and is involved with political setting. So such kind of a research is going on in Europe and contributes also to rights-based approaches issues. But now I give floor to Adriana Careaga.
Thank you, Riin. And thank you all for being here, and the ones that are going to see the video afterwards, because it's going to be on our web page in ICOMOS. So this initiative of Heritage Thursday, Alicia Castillo is not here from Spain, but it's an initiative, and the moderators of all our workshops are even with Ave, myself, and Alicia. So I'm going to talk about a course that we already did with Eduardo Romero, another member of our group from Brazil. I'm from Uruguay, that we held a course in this August, September from the University of São Paulo, that the course had the objectives of just present ethical political conception in human rights, knowing concepts about cultural rights and implications for the preservation of cultural heritage, to present some operational notions of ethics in human rights in preservation practice the application of human rights principles through the survey of cultural traces. This course was to postgraduate students from architecture, from the Faculty of Architecture, and we did it online, 100%, not hybrid, because this course was based on another workshop we did last year, 2020, for Latin America. So the format was as I said, online, and it was interactive and participative course. Next slide, please. What we are proposing for 2022 to our group is just to do another online course, because in Latin America we have the difficulty of traveling, and it's very expensive to travel from one place to other. So I think this modality or this way of doing things just come to stay. So we are thinking about doing just an online course, and just organized by the State University of São Paulo, and is going to be open and of course center on heritage and human rights. Again, another proposal we have for 2022 is just to set up a Latin American Permanent Forum on heritage and right-based approach, that in a roundtable forum. We already have a heritage risk forum for Latin America, so we are proposing this forum just to analyze the cases and just to study. And of course, this is going to be online platform. Last thing I want to stress is our group, the RBA, honor diversity and honor multilingualism. So I'm very sorry that we didn't translate our, I just realized. Thank you, Rin.
Thank you, Adriana. And now we go to our theme, inspirational documents. And why have we chosen such a theme is because when you look on all the different documents, you sometimes see that they might be contradictory among themselves. There might be overlaps in many of them. And sometimes you have the feeling that a document is not about real life. It's a thing per se. So it's not connected to real life. But at the same time, ICOMOS as an organization is one of the biggest facilitators to create different charters and doctrinal texts. And knowing this and knowing the process, how this is done, we can say that that creating these doctrinal texts actually is a perfect base for international discussion, for the debates on the values of heritage and the ways how we should address the restoration activities and others. And these texts, they reflect the development of the theory and the practice. So that is one of the reasons we choose this theme for our workshop.
Apologies. Thank you, Rin. Ave mentioned in the news the presentation that the working group made to the Theophilus conference in Florence in September. And these slides are from that presentation. And what we looked at were some of the documents which are of immense relevance to our common dignity, rights-based approaches, thinking and aims. And they're both ICOMOS authored and non-ICOMOS authored documents. But ICOMOS has made a contribution to them all. So it's not all. Ave mentioned the Stockholm and Buenos Aires declarations, which marked the 50th and 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Universal Human Rights. There's also our own ethical principles, in a sense, our code, our way of practicing. And the important aspect of these is that they identify access and enjoyment of cultural heritage, as well as its conservation, as being of critical importance. The next slide. Again, the the involvement and the contribution of the working group and ICOMOS to the 2019 amendment of the operational guidelines to implement the World Heritage Convention, which have now embedded human rights-based approaches, rights holders as stated and explicit principles and requirements in World Heritage. So it straddles from identification, nomination, management, and protection processes of World Heritage properties. And then the next slide, Rin, and moving away a little from the directly authored, although we're very involved in some of the more recent involvements, and two of these we will hear in more detail shortly. The European Quality Principles, of course, is an ICOMOS-led document, and the Guidance for Impact Assessments, which is developed by the three advisory bodies, but other documents. And just really maybe to finish this short introduction by referring to the really important word or adjective in this title, inspirational documents, that on the paper, these are wonderful, and they can be wonderful as academic and theoretical and philosophical concepts. But it's how these documents, and maybe this is for our presenters to respond to, and the questions and answers afterwards, the discussion, is how do these translate then into inspirational and inspiring good practice, we hope, both within our own organization and our own membership, but also beyond that to influence policymakers, to give encouragement and support to communities, that these principles are on the page, but they are also in active practice. So the last thing I'll say, Rin, before you can introduce our speakers, is just to remind everybody to use the chat box. So please, if you have any questions or comments, please put them into the chat box. Paulette has asked that you respond as well at the end of the document, but just that allows us then to hopefully provoke some good discussion at the end of the presentations. So thanks, Rin.
Thank you, Gronia. And I can cite already Margaret Cohen from Chatbox that in the research conducted for the ADCOM, Advisory Committee meeting of ICOMOS, the charters and doctrinals texts were considered essential by a majority of national committees and international scientific committees, but there were comments calling for wider translation, which definitely is a case, and what we have been addressing in ICOMOS widely, because it's this question of language is very important in communication and understanding of the texts, and for updating of documents. And we know very well from the past that Venice Charter has been opened several times for the discussion to update it, but at the end it has never been changed. But now we go to our presentations, and the first presenter comes from Australia. It's Professor Richard Mackay, who is a very well-known World Heritage expert, and he's currently the ICOMOS focal point for the World Heritage Leadership Program, Heritage Impact Assessment Guidance Project. So he will talk us about some updated documents. The floor is yours, Richard.
Thank you, Rin, and thank you to Gronia. And I also thank the OCD-RBA working group and particularly the language group for assistance with my presentation. Now I'm trying to share the screen. Yes, it's just been permitted. Thank you. And can I just confirm, please, that the screen is now showing the first slide?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, thank you and good evening, colleagues. The World Heritage Leadership Program, which is funded by the Norwegian government, has been working for approximately 3 years now to produce a new integrated guidance and toolkit for heritage impact assessment in a World Heritage context. And this is a collaborative project involving ICOMOS, ICROM and IUCN, the 3 advisory bodies to the World Heritage Committee, in conjunction with the World Heritage Centre and the International Association for Impact Assessment. And it's intended that the forthcoming guidance will incorporate, improve and supersede preceding documents, including particularly the ICOMOS guidance on heritage impact assessments for cultural World Heritage properties from 2011 and the IUCN advice note related to impact assessment. And it's hoped that this document, which is due for initial release later this year, will become the standard that is used by the World Heritage Committee, the World Heritage Centre, and in time by states parties. Now, by way of just a quick recap, the process for impact assessment has grown dramatically over recent decades and can lead to significantly improved decision-making for World Heritage properties, indeed for all natural and cultural heritage properties. It does that by providing a framework which allows some unpacking of how attributes contribute to outstanding universal value, and then enabling a rigorous process which relates those attributes to the impacts of potential changes in a very systematic and detailed way. So this is a structured and rigorous approach. It also involves the identification of the necessary documentation, sources and resources, documenting the logic of the decision-making process, importantly, separating the identification of what are the impacts from their evaluation. In other words, how serious are they? And ultimately, the intention of the guidelines is to guide decisions which will avoid or reduce adverse impacts on outstanding universal value. I'd like to highlight, just before I get into the specifics of the emerging guidance, that there is a fundamental core logic which, to which ICOMOS in its various guises through ISCs, through the Secretariat, and through a range of doctrines and charters has contributed over decades. And that core logic is summarised on the screen and I hope in the chat box notes for non-English speaking participants. The first stage is to understand what the attributes of the World Heritage property are contributing to its OUV. And for some properties that's well articulated, but for others it's not. The second thing is to understand the proposal. And quite often the proposal itself is not well scoped because it may have elements that transcend the property, or it may be that activities outside the property or its buffer zone may affect outstanding universal value. There's then a need to understand exactly how what's proposed will affect the attributes that contribute to OUV. And significantly, they can be positive or negative. And then there's the judgment, whether they're acceptable, are there better alternatives? An important step, which is often left out, I must say, by state parties, is to have a moment where it's possible to contemplate and decide whether the project should proceed. And then finally, if the project does proceed, what can be done to avoid or reduce or compensate for the impacts. Now, the emerging guidance can be summarised in the chart that's on the screen. And I'm conscious that this has an enormous amount of information. Again, thanks to the language group for providing it in both English and French. But the thing I would like to highlight in terms of inspiration for the Our Common Dignity rights-based approaches working group and followers is that participation by stakeholders, including rights holders, is seen as a pervasive process that needs to happen across all 11 steps of the guidance and approach. The second pervasive process is proactive problem solving. And so the way in which this guidance is arranged takes practitioners and authorities, state parties and regulators through this 11-step process. of screening and scoping to determine what is needed. That will typically be undertaken by the state party or the regulatory authorities. Then through the main doing of the impact assessment, a baseline assessment, consideration of the action and alternatives, identification of the impacts, evaluation of the impacts, identification of mitigation and enhancement, and finally reporting. And that will normally be done by the project team. And then at the other end of the process, steps 9, 10, and 11, the report needs to be reviewed, the decisions need to be made, and there needs to be follow-up. And typically that will revert back to the project proponent and the state party through its relevant institutions. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to present this evening, but I'm also conscious of the limited time, and I beg your indulgence as I move now very quickly through these 11 steps, plus the preparatory participation process to give you some idea of what this new guidance will contain. I've mentioned the importance of participation and the roles of right holders and stakeholders. So these may be the traditional participants, the institutional representatives or the heritage specialists, but there may be a range of other sector specialists, sociologists, health specialists, engineers, economics and lawyers. And there will be a range of engagement methods. And it's important that the engagement methods reflect the nature of the stakeholders involved. At one end of the scale, there will be people who simply need to be informed, who can be communicated with through media, through websites, and through non-interactive processes. Then in the middle, there'll be people who may be involved in consultation. They may get more directly involved through discussions. They may even become collaborators. And at the right-hand end of this image, there will be those who have rights. There will be people like traditional custodians who are rights holders for the property, and the process needs to understand that they are empowered and, in fact, in some cases, will have decision-making roles. And significantly, these people all need to be reflected in the participatory processes for impact assessment. And so it's not just a question of project proponent or state party or heritage consultant expert. There is also, on the left of this screen, the need for involvement by rights holders such as traditional custodians who might hold cultural rights and speak for country. And on the right-hand side of the screen, technical experts who can provide additional specialist expertise that is not heritage expertise, which can enable an understanding of what the options are and can look at things like innovative mitigation that removes or reduces the impact of a development. So participation involves both ends of the spectrum, from the technical expert through to the rights holder. I'm now going to move, as I mentioned, quickly through the 11 steps. The first of these is a screening factor, and this is determining whether, in fact, a heritage impact assessment is necessary. And the guidelines explain that this is a dual judgment. It's partly a judgment in relation to the nature of the development or the activity itself, predominantly on the right-hand side here, whether it's small scale or it's reversible or it's temporary or it's not likely to have a direct physical impact on the property. That will suggest that perhaps the impact assessment is not needed. Whereas on the right-hand side, if it is a permanent, irreversible, large-scale proposal within the buffer zone or having high potential for impact on the property, it is very likely that an HIA will be needed. These are ultimately, under the convention, judgments to be made by the state party, but they will be a balanced judgment that takes into account the nature of the property and the nature of the action, activity or development that is proposed. And the test in paragraph 172 of the operational guidelines is whether the activity could affect the outstanding universal value of the property. Screening significantly needs to understand that most of the problematic projects that affect World Heritage properties happen outside the property itself. and it's the vectors, the downstream impacts, the additional tourism, the changes to the environment, the factors that commence outside the property but affect the values inside the property that are often most problematic in terms of impactful projects. Importantly, having decided that an impact assessment is necessary, the scoping needs to be undertaken. And as was the case in the 2011 guidance, it will be suggested that preparation of a proper terms of reference through a scoping study that identifies the issues and alternatives to be addressed and the resources, information and specialists or other participants that are required will be necessary. The next step is an important one, and this is the baseline assessment. And for many properties inscribed on the World Heritage List, there is very good information brought together in the World Heritage website through the Statement of Outstanding Universal Value and other documents such as nomination dossiers and evaluation reports. But for some properties, this information does not exist. And what's really important here is understanding the attributes of the property that contribute or convey the outstanding universal value. And a very quick cheat sheet, easy way to start is to look at the statement of OUV and look at the descriptive language it uses. I've put on screen here the Singgiran early man site from Indonesia, the Homo erectus fossil site. And when you actually look, and you can go straight to the World Heritage website to look down in the statement of OUV, words like many aspects of long-term human physical and cultural evolution, or human and animal fossils, or the fact that they're found in a natural context, or that they illustrate the sequence of human cultural and environmental evolution, give a very easy way straight to the key attributes of the property which convey its OUV. And this notion of being specific about attributes is a fundamental platform of the new guidance, because it is a question of whether or not proposed activity will affect those very attributes. There's then a need to scope the action and the alternatives. And two issues are important here. Firstly, that the action itself is well understood, the totality of the nature of the development, its consequence in terms of construction impacts or transport impacts or changes to the local community, and the fact that there may be consequential activities both within and outside the property that can affect it. And the example I put on screen quickly is one that has been before the committee over recent years, the proposed Heumarkt development in the historic centre of Vienna. And it is the kind of documentation on screen, the visualisation that shows what the activity will look like, that will enable those undertaking the assessment to understand. And it's really important to be persistent and to require adequate drawings or plans or reports, photographs, briefings, presentations or visualisations, so that the judgment about the impact on attributes of OUV is actually well informed by a good understanding of the proposed activity. Continuing with this example from Vienna, the next step is separate, which is, this is the same step. This is still exactly what I've just said about adequate documentation. Vienna, which is available on the website, and the HIA done by Michael Kloos and Associates, is a really fabulous example because of the way it connects the historic imagery to current imagery, the two top images on screen, and then in the bottom image on screen provides a very clear understanding of the effect of the proposed development. The next step is evaluating impacts. And for those of you familiar with the ICOMOS 2011 guidance, this will be very familiar, that there is now a need to judge the consequence of the impact that's been identified and whether its effect on the property will be neutral or slight or moderate or large or very large. And the colour coding and the methodology, which has proven very successful, particularly in putting summary information before decision makers, is carried through to some of the tools that will be provided as part of the associated toolkit. I mentioned at the beginning that the notion of problem solving should permeate the entirety of these 11 steps, as should regular participation by relevant experts and stakeholders. But having identified impacts, there is then a process of changing the activity to avoid or to minimise adverse impacts, or sometimes to enhance positive impacts. And enhancing positive impacts, for example, might be removing an obstruction to a historic view. Having mitigated, it's then necessary to reassess and reevaluate the impacts. So there is a feedback loop incorporated within the process and the guidance. And having done this, it's then necessary to prepare a cohesive report. The example on screen is another well-known heritage impact assessment for a World Heritage property at Villa Adriana in Italy, where the development which was proposed was outside the World Heritage property. A very clear report, again available on the web, which shows that the effect of the new development would have a devastating visual impact. And as you'll see shortly, the report including the grading, and you can see the 2 red grades in the example on screen, showing that there would be a large negative impact on OUV and a very large negative impact on other values. And in this case, the report actually had the consequence of causing the development not to proceed. The report's then reviewed. The review takes place in 2 ways. One is an internal review, usually by the national decision maker, the regulator of the state party, but also in a World Heritage context, in accordance with paragraph 172, or if there has been a committee decision, there will be a review by the World Heritage Committee, and that is where ICOMOS gets involved in an advisory capacity through a technical review. Having done all of this, there is then, of course, a decision. And importantly, I've mentioned a couple of times, it is really important that even up to this point, it is available to the relevant authorities to decide that the activity should not proceed because of its effect on OUV. And the best example of that in recent years was the HIA for the development in the vicinity of Villa Adriana, which resulted in that development not proceeding to avoid impacts on outstanding universal value of the World Heritage property. The final step, often overlooked, is that in most cases, the project in fact does proceed. And it is very important that the report, which is delivered by the impact assessment team, includes a set of recommendations and a mitigation strategy, that they are taken on board as conditions when the relevant authority makes its decision. They then go forward into the project itself in the form of guidelines and implementation as whatever the project is ultimately implemented. So colleagues, that is a very rapid introduction and a run through the 11 steps to the emerging guidance. It has been a long journey. There have been some phases of consultation with national committees and international scientific committees. There has been a lot of behind the scene works to get IUCN, ICOMOS, ICROM, International Association of Impact Assessment, and the Centre on the same page. But I am very confident that the guidance will be issued in its initial form, which I should point out is English, before the end of the year, and one would hope translated into other languages very soon thereafter. And thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you very much. It is, even though it was so short, it was very informative. And I'm sorry, I forgot to warn that Richard, as he is in Australia, in another time zone, he has to leave also for some other meetings after his presentation. So we have to take the questions for Richard now. Is there anybody who wants to take the opportunity?
I might ask Richard a quick question, Richard, and thank you very much for a really wonderfully clear presentation on a complex work, I understand. But one of the things is, in terms of the who will lead the heritage impact assessment process, or how do you see? Because obviously collaboration will be a very important aspect of the process, particularly in ensuring the level of engagement of the different participants is appropriate. So I suppose maybe if you have had any considerations as to the, in practice, you know, who leads and how do we ensure an independence and an objectivity in the process?
Yeah, well, thank you, Grania. I think as most participants today will know, the World Heritage System is not a perfect system and has a political dimension which differs between states parties. So one of the intentions of these guidelines, as with most doctrines and charters, is to try and establish a baseline standard, and sooner rather than later to have the World Heritage Committee apply this new guidance. In other words, to make decisions which request that the state parties undertake HIA in accordance with these guidance. And the guidance has been particularly prepared to align as far as we can across the 194 states parties with national and regional practices. Ultimately, it will be the responsibility of the lawful consent authority. Now, in some states parties, that is the national government. In others, it's a regional government. And in some, it bounces back and forth, usually to avoid accountability. But it will ultimately come down to the HIA team, in other words, usually the consultant team, to be sure that stakeholders and participants are engaged in a way that is commensurate with their entitlement, as per the diagram that I put up early on, and for the regulatory authorities within states parties to back that. It's not going to be a magic wand that is waved and instantly achieves all of that. But what this will do is put into play a new standard, which includes things like the independence of the team and a formal step of mitigation and re-review, and the roles of rights holders and stakeholders, so that there is a basis and a standard, you know, to which we can take developers, regulatory authorities, and say this is the standard that should be applied in this context. And I should say, while the process has been prepared for World Heritage properties and the language is all about World Heritage properties, it will work perfectly well for other natural and cultural heritage assets.
Thank you.
Thank you. And there's a question from Hossam Mahdi. If the process applies also to already executed developments in retrospect?
Hello, Hossam. No, not look, it's intended that this impact assessment process is derived towards decision-making for proposed actions which may affect OUV and are therefore falling within the parameters of paragraph 172 of the operational guidelines to the convention. What we are envisaging is that these guidelines will be applied for impact assessment in two scenarios. One is where the development proponents, state party themselves, know that there is an issue with the World Heritage property. So as a matter of good practice, they will do an impact assessment using this methodology. The other way is when the World Heritage Committee itself, through the state of conservation process, requests that the HIA be done. I myself have a particular aversion, because of my experience as a World Heritage advisor, to retrospective HIAs which are done when the project is already physically built. I think that is, it actually undercuts the process. It would be better to perhaps just use part of the methodology which says, well, given the impact on OUV, what options are available to mitigate adverse impacts or enhance positive impacts. So there may be some steps in the process that can help for an existing project, but this this process is about good decision making in advance of proposed activities and should always include this project must not proceed conclusion as a possibility.
Thank you, Richard. There are some more questions. One by Ebrim Ulusan, and who asked, what will be the process for reviewing the HIA reports for the properties in the tentative list? Which institution should be at the final stage for approval? State party, World Heritage Center, national committees? It's a hot potato for those properties.
Yes, it's very difficult. At a technical level, the World Heritage Committee does not have a role in that process for a property that's on the tentative list, other than through occasional general decisions that might apply to a region subject to conflict or something like that. So it would normally be a matter for the state party authorities and their more general obligations under Articles 4 and 5 of the Convention. And so this is a helpful methodology that helps with management of the values of places on the tentative list and those obligations under Article 4 and 5 of the Convention. The advisory bodies would normally not have a formal role, except perhaps through an upstream process. So a state party that is preparing a nomination could, for example, approach ICOMOS for technical advice about a development in a project, a development that is in a property that is on the tentative list, and ICOMOS might provide technical review advice at that point.
Thank you. I will read two more questions, and the rest we will answer by email. So it is Andrew Croft asked, many countries operate a polluter-based principle, and most HIAs are therefore funded by developers who appoint their own consultants. Is it intended for this guidance to suggest that HIAs need to be led by an independent party, not connected to state party or developer?
This is a very good point. It is best and preferable that the impact assessment is indeed funded by the development proponent, but that the team is actually independently directly accountable to the state party authority, not to the developer. But of course, in the real world, that's not always possible. Sometimes it is the state party itself that is the development proponent. And sometimes, because of the way in which impact assessment is undertaken under national statutes, it is the proponent in any case. So the guidelines are prepared to work across multiple jurisdictions, and they highlight that the desirability and the principle of independence, and the best way for that is when the team reports to the regulator, not to the development proponent. But they also work when that is simply not possible. So they work in both circumstances.
Okay, thank you, Richard. And do you want to comment on the question by Yerko Garcia that where can you make an international complaint about misintervention in archaeological heritage?
Put very simply, without knowing the specifics, if this is a World Heritage property, any individual can write directly to the World Heritage Centre under paragraph 174 of the operational guidelines, and the centre is obliged then to refer that complaint for advice to the state party on the basis of the civil society intervention.
And if it is not a World Heritage site, then ICOMOS is taking care also all types of protected heritage. So you can always address ICOMOS too.
National committees of ICOMOS and different national committees have different policies. You know, some national committees will only become involved in national or World Heritage places, not in local heritage places. It's tricky.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you very much. And we proved it's very inspirational. So thank you.
And hello to all my colleagues online.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now we will go on with our next presentation, which is going to be a video, because our dear colleagues, whom you can see on the screen now, the members of ICOMOS Scientific Committee on Cultural Tourism are participating in their annual event, and therefore are not here with us today. And we have the background of their joint presentation is quite broad, as you can see also from the introduction, that among them are archaeologists, heritage professionals, planning and management professionals, tourism professionals, and art history professionals. So I will stop sharing the screen and we will soon see the video. And while the video is put up, I'm happy to tell you that the Cultural Tourism Charter that they are talking about was adopted just yesterday by ICOMOS Advisory Committee.
Good morning. We are the drafting group that has dealt with the new ICOMOS International Cultural Tourism Charter of 2021 draft charter that was presented yesterday to the ADCOM meeting. We would have liked a lot to be here with you in this webinar this morning to present this draft charter right-based approach to cultural heritage tourism, but unfortunately we had our annual meeting also this morning and it was impossible. The drafting group of the task force of the charter has been composed by myself, Celia Martinez, Cecily Smith Christensen, and Margaret Gowen and Fergus McLaren, and we will be presenting separate parts from right now. I will start with the background and stressing that the International Scientific Committee on Cultural Tourism decided that it was necessary to review the 1999 ICOMOS International Cultural Tourism Charter at its annual meeting in Florence in 2017 in order to update the charter to the many issues and new concepts that had been arising during those 20 years. In 2019, following the first draft revision, the board decided that that revision was not practical precisely due to the thing to update to many other issues and concerns. So in 2020, the ICTC task force established a drafting group and circulated a text to the ICTC members. But also in that year, we had the COVID-19 tremendous global disruption and collapse, in fact, in tourism that made us to change our views and our goals also. So we drafted again. And from April to May 2021, that second draft was sent to all ICOMOS International Scientific Committees, national committees, and partner organizations for comments, of which we received 27 responses that were very interesting, analyzed, and integrated into the third and final draft from June to July. In September and November, this third and final draft has been circulated and presented for approval to the advisory committee meetings of October and November, and hopefully the draft new charter will be adopted at our next ICOMOS General Assembly in 2022. With regards to the evolution, if Margaret wishes to follow.
The objectives and principles of the 2021 Charter were to maintain the essence of the 99 Charter and its concern for community, while addressing the 20 years of emerging challenges and policy developments. In the background, there was the International Development Agenda, which was from the Millennium Development Goals through to the current Agenda 2030. A move from heritage, cultural heritage in particular, regarded as an economic resource and a tourism as a vehicle for economic development, to much broader considerations of sustainability. Exponential growth in tourism during those 20 years led to mass tourism and over-tourism and many unsustainable developments at tourism destinations. Climate change in the meantime became pervasive, and the Paris Agreement began to focus on mitigation and adaptation. Global disruption of COVID-19, as Celia said, caused collapse and a fundamental rethinking in how tourism needs to be managed. Rights-based issues relating to unsustainable development are at the heart of this charter. We are conscious of displacement, unemployment, employment vulnerability, and lack of benefit share in situations where cultural tourism takes place. So the charter seeks to reorientate practice from notions of sustainability to a much more important notion of the resilience of those communities who host tourism destinations, a need for transformative change and a change towards regenerative development as a paradigm. Next slide. The task force's aims, therefore, were to develop a foundational and overarching, and indeed an aspirational framework, a set of guiding principles for professionals and practitioners right across heritage and tourism domains. It aimed to provide a set of principles that could be operationalized globally and supported by regional guidelines in the future. It aimed to integrate current cross-country global policy orientations, including the Paris Agreement and especially the 2030 Agenda, right through to rights-based approaches. It also aimed to maintain structural simplicity, clarity, and especially language accessibility.
The draft 2021 Charter integrates 20 years of academic, professional, and institutional experience and the many suggestions received through consultations. It speaks to three objectives. Objective 1, to strengthen cultural heritage protection and community rights through a set of principles informing responsible tourism planning and management. Objective 2, promoting stakeholder collaboration and participatory governance in the stewardship of cultural heritage and management of tourism. And Objective 3, guiding cultural heritage management and tourism supporting the UN SDGs and climate action. While the 1999 Charter principles are aspirational, the new charter speaks more directly to professionals, practitioners, and policymakers in the cultural heritage and tourism domains. It seeks to identify and support agency across stakeholders. By acknowledging complex challenges and dilemmas, careful application of established as well as new concepts, including reference to sustainability, it contributes a contemporary, forward-looking, and empowering narrative. Here you see the set of 7 principles which you will be able to read in your own time and which are also broadly translated. While building on the existing principles, the new charter aspires transformational efforts. Beyond community involvement, the charter calls for reinforcement of rights and participatory governance. Beyond the opportunity for economic benefits, it seeks to enhance resilience towards future disruptions by integrating climate actions in the management of cultural heritage and tourism. Formulated in the context of the 2030 Agenda, Climate Change, Over Tourism and Disruptions, it introduces a number of new concepts not mentioned in the early charter. Most of these concepts will be familiar, others we discovered less so. Specifically, the reference to heritage as commons refer to cultural heritage belonging to a group of people and governed in common through participatory governance and collaborative stewardship. Well established both in practice and scholarship, The Commons approach offers an antidote to heritage as property, where economic gains can be increased by exclusion and exploitation, underpinning the unsustainable growth paradigm. By deliberately introducing a commons approach alongside the other concepts, we believe the new charter has the potential to become transformational. The next steps for the charter involves a review before it's presented for approval by ICOMOS General Assembly and hopefully adoption next year in Thailand. The draft charter is concurrently translated and will be made available on ICOMOS and ICTC platforms. As for dissemination and implementation, the charter will be promoted for use by national committees, international scientific committees, and ICOMOS partners involved with culture tourism planning, development, and management. It will also provide the framework in the forthcoming Destination Resilience Index commissioned by the Organization of World Heritage Cities. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you to our colleagues for this presentation. And tourism definitely is one of the most important fields in change in nowadays. But now we will go on with the presentation on European quality principles for EU-funded interventions. And the presentation is going to be made by Ondina Daut from Romania. And Ondina has a very, very rich experience from different EU institutions. So I think she knows best of all of us how much such documents like quality principles are needed in real life. Please, Ondina.
Thank you, Rin, for the introduction, and good afternoon from Romania to all of you watching us right now. I am honored to present this document, especially since I know that I will be doing this in the presence of some of the authors. During the last years, I was very fortunate to work alongside some of the best professionals from our generation, and to witness this extraordinary process that led to the crafting of the document that we now call European Quality Principles for EU-funded interventions with potential impact upon cultural heritage. Beyond its technocratic name, that is meant especially to appeal to the EU administration, what we have here is a remarkable document that should serve as guide for the assessment and funding of all interventions on cultural heritage or potentially impacting cultural heritage. Next slide, please. This work stemmed from a real need because during the last multi-annual financial frameworks, the European Union, in its effort to contribute to the preservation of cultural heritage, awarded large-scale funding for this purpose. The funds came over a rather short period of time and reached the far distant corners of the EU. At the same time, the programs were designed as a shared management mechanism, which is EU language for a division of the responsibilities between the European Commission and the member states, with the responsibility for the protection of the cultural heritage falling on the participating countries. Without going into the technicalities of this process, let's just note that, in reality, this well-intended action proved to be more challenging and complex than it was initially expected. Next slide, please. In 2014, when the EU was looking to redefine its policy in relation to cultural heritage, it was becoming more and more obvious that additional provisions had to be added for cultural heritage funding. I was, at the time, following the issue very closely as policy advisor to the MAP in charge with drafting the European Parliament's resolution towards an integrated approach to cultural heritage for Europe. Over the weeks and months that we worked on this file, we started to receive accounts from all over Europe about different problems related to the projects funded with EU grants. The problems vary from improper use of materials and restoration techniques to misuses of the heritage site within reconversion projects or unfortunate collisions between different projects funded by different programs, but impacting the same heritage site. As you can imagine, this is a very sensitive topic, not only because it involves different approaches to heritage restoration and reuse, but also because in the framework of an EU-funded project, talking about these problems can lead to financial corrections and political vendetta. As a first step into the right direction, the European Parliament delivered a clear message by adopting the following paragraph in its 2015 resolution. And I'm going to quote from the resolution itself. So paragraph 9 urges the Commission to include in the guidelines governing the next generation of structural funds for cultural heritage a compulsory quality control system to apply throughout a project's life cycle. Next slide, please. Of course, at the time, all the EU institutions agreed that the issue had to be taken into consideration, and a dialogue started between the services involved in the different stages of the funding programs. When it was time to design the European Year of Cultural Heritage 2018, this topic, as you can imagine, was on top of the list. It later became the flagship initiative Cherishing Heritage that I think everybody knows by now. The European Commission, via its DG Education and Culture, was trusted with implementing this action. They did so by setting up a working group of experts assembled by ICOMOS. Their mandate was to provide guidance on quality principles for all stakeholders directly or indirectly engaged in EU-funded interventions that could impact on cultural heritage, mainly built heritage and cultural landscapes. Therefore, the potential beneficiaries of these guidelines are the European institutions, the managing authorities in the member states, the international organizations working in the field of cultural heritage, but also the civil society at large, the local communities, and the private sector. A first version of this document was released in 2019 and was later on revised and consolidated. We now have the 2020 edition available for download from the ICOMOS website. Next slide, please. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of this document because I invite you all to download it from the ICOMOS website. And if I can add a recommendation, please don't just look at the abridged version and take the time to read the whole document because it is extremely useful. In total, there are 40 recommendations that are divided into the following categories: principles and standards, advancing quality principles, programming at EU and national levels, project briefs and tenders, design, procurement, implementation, monitoring and evaluation, governance, risk assessment and mitigation, research, education and training, and rewarding quality. As you can see, the issues vary from very general considerations about cultural heritage preservation to practical topics such as awarding criteria for grants, tendering procedures, or risk assessment. As I said, the document is available for free on the ICOMOS website, where you can find the English and French versions, but the document will soon be available in other languages as well, thanks to the efforts of the ICOMOS national committees. Next slide, please. Coming back to the topic of today's discussion, let me briefly outline why I think that this is a truly inspirational document. First of all, it responds to a real need. As recalled in the beginning of my intervention, this document is the result of a long process, which started in 2014 and whose first milestone was the publication of the Quality Principles document. At the time, ICOMOS played a fundamental role in the common reflection, and ICOMOS now has the opportunity to further disseminate these recommendations at European and international level. This document can fill in the expertise gap. The reality is that the high-level professional expertise needed to properly carry out a cultural heritage intervention is not always available for all the sites in all our cities and villages, especially when you have a limited amount of time to access the funding and to implement the project. These quality principles could, therefore, guide the potential beneficiaries of EU funds in their efforts to prepare a good project. And in order to make things easier for them, there is a list at the end of the document with the key questions to follow. Also, this document can guide you through the hard choices. Well, we all know how it goes. Theory is one thing, but in situ realities are another story. The heritage site managers or the authorities in charge often have to face the hard choices of our profession. Questions like, how much do we restore? What do we use? What do we use instead? Who will actually be able to do it? How will the community react? What do we need it for now? Who will pay for all this? And of course, is it all eligible expense? For all these questions and many more, this document can be used as reference. Also, this is a much needed policy tool. It started as a policy project and it could potentially be used at all levels of governance. Let's not forget that the 2015 EP resolution requested a compulsory quality control system to be included in the regulation, and this starting with the 2021-2027 MFF. Well, this is not yet the case, since the present document is not legally binding, but this should not prevent the policymakers to take it into account when dealing with legislation and programs funding or impacting cultural heritage. This document will surely pass the test of time. The next 100 years will not look like the last 100 years. But while the technology and the tools will certainly change, these basic principles will continue to define our domain and serve as starting point for the discussions that now we can only imagine. Last and certainly not least, it is a generational effort and you are all invited to join. If I can add a personal statement, we all get to pick our battles, but this one, I think, it's worth fighting for. Thank you very much, and I prefer to use the remaining time to answer to possible questions.
Thank you, Andina. I hope you don't mind that we will leave all the questions after our last presentation, and then we can debate it all together. But definitely, this quality principle is a document really well needed, because some things that we consider self-evident among heritage professionals are not like that among the others. But now I'm happy to give the floor to the members of our rights-based approaches working group. Benedikt Selfslag and Jelka Pirkovic, who both have very in-depth knowledge in the issues. And Benedikt is a mastermind behind many ICOMOS documents and policies. And Jelka Pirkovic, I'm really happy to highlight that as Slovenia is now the presidency of EU, Jelka has managed to take cultural heritage issues really very high level to the discussion. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can we have the, yes. Thank you for showing the slides. Well, I will speak in French with a little bit of English to show that we are really practicing the diversity of languages. Jelka et moi, nous sommes ravis de vous présenter la Convention de Faro et quelques-uns de ses aspects moins connus. The next slide, please. La Convention de Faro est une convention cadre du Conseil de l'Europe sur la valeur du patrimoine culturel pour la société. Est-ce un document influent ou une source d'inspiration? Premièrement, il s'agit d'une convention cadre qui complète les conventions de Grenade sur le patrimoine architectural, la Convention de Malte sur le patrimoine archéologique et la Convention de Florence sur les paysages. Deuxièmement, c'est la première convention internationale et européenne qui porte sur l'ensemble du patrimoine, tout type de patrimoine, y compris le patrimoine mobilier et le patrimoine immobilier. Next slide, please. L'approche holistique du patrimoine ainsi que l'importance accordée à la participation et aux communautés sont des points tellement bien connus de la Convention de Faro, au point que parfois on a tendance à oublier d'autres éléments novateurs de cette convention. Il s'agit par exemple du droit du patrimoine qui implique le respect du patrimoine des autres, mais aussi qu'on est passé du droit du patrimoine comme impliqué dans les conventions de Grenade, de Malte et de Florence déjà mentionnées, au droit au patrimoine. So we moved from heritage law to the right to heritage. That's an important shift. Mais aussi, les intervenants précédents sur d'autres textes qui inspirent ont parlé d'impact sur le patrimoine, d'utilisation durable des ressources patrimoniales, et de la qualité. Je tiens à vous rappeler que ces mots-clés figurent également déjà dans la Convention de Faro. Alors, cette convention cadre est ratifiée par 21 États membres, signée par 7 autres États, mais on ne peut pas mesurer le succès d'une convention uniquement au taux de ratification. Force est de reconnaître que la Convention de Faro a fait l'objet de nombreuses recherches universitaires et que cette convention invite à l'action. Au fond, on a constaté que la société civile s'est emparée de la Convention de Faro au point que dans mon pays, par exemple, il y a un institut Faro, mais qui, contrairement à ce que souhaite la Convention, l'Institut Faro ne s'occupe que du patrimoine immatériel et patrimoine mobilier. Enfin, passons maintenant aux origines. Can I have the next slide, please? Fin des années 80, il y avait déjà une initiative au sein du Conseil de l'Europe pour protéger le patrimoine, quel que soit le contexte politique actuel. Et on pense notamment aux guerres des Balkans et à la destruction des Bouddhas de Bamiyan. Donc, c'était vraiment une préoccupation des cadres et des mécanismes de décision du Conseil de l'Europe. Et donc, était née l'idée d'un protocole additionnel aux conventions de Grenade et de Malte. Toujours est-il que ces conventions devaient porter sur l'ensemble du patrimoine et il n'y avait pas lieu vraiment de faire une distinction par rapport au patrimoine qui était menacé par ces conflits. En 2003, un nouveau mandat a été donné et ce mandat a été élargi avec la demande de répondre à l'ensemble des défis globaux. Pourquoi? Parce que la Convention devait être attrayante pour l'ensemble des États. Et en 2003 et en 2004, il y a eu la création d'un groupe d'experts, un comité de rédaction dont Yelka et moi-même faisions partie. Ce groupe a eu trois réunions et puis il y a eu une longue procédure de consultation. Avant de passer la parole à Yelka pour qu'elle explique quelques éléments de contenu, je voulais tout de même vous rappeler quelques défis que ce projet de convention de Faro a rencontré lors de la rédaction. Alors, premièrement, c'était que les États ne voulaient pas que ce nouvel instrument soit directement opposable. Le deuxième défi, c'était qu'il y avait c'est qu'on craignait qu'elle ferait double emploi avec la Convention de l'UNESCO sur la diversité culturelle ou le patrimoine immatériel. Enfin, certains craignaient que les droits culturels n'allaient pas aboutir parce qu'il y avait eu une initiative avortée dans le passé. Et le dernier point qui fera la transition vers Yelka, c'est que le patrimoine culturel était considéré comme une ressource, or il aurait pu être exploité. I'm just maybe making a summary of the four challenges, which are not on the slide, that we encountered as a drafting group. The first one is that state parties did not want to have a binding instrument that people could use to go immediately to courts. That's the reason why it's a framework convention. The second one was that people feared that this new instrument would be a duplication of the Intangible Heritage Convention or the Convention on Cultural Diversity that UNESCO was developing. The third one was that there had been in the past an initiative on cultural rights, but it was abandoned, and they feared that this again would not be a successful end. And the last is that heritage is seen as a resource, but in fact it could also be exploited. Now, how the content was developed, I leave it to Jelke to explain it further. Next slide, please.
Hello, also from my side. Hello to everybody. I will be brief in explaining something that is quite a complex instrument. So I will first develop some ideas about the context and the purpose of the convention. And let me start with the notion that, well, if you want to see in more detail what is all about, you should first of all consult the convention itself and maybe also the explanatory report to the convention. Both are published on the Council of Europe's website. So from the explanatory report, we see that the intention behind the convention is to provide a framework of reference for heritage policies, particularly in the context of the rights and the responsibilities in this area, and the positive benefits which can be drawn from the use of the heritage as a cultural capital. So this is something that also Benedict expressed as a concern. But if we see the intention, that is the balance between the rights and the responsibilities, we also see that the convention speaks about the responsibilities to a large extent. So the context, which was in 2003 to 2005, when the convention was prepared and finally signed in Faro in Portugal, is a development that leads towards the democratization of heritage, which is now even more put to the front. The second important issue is the development of the concept that heritage rights are part of cultural rights as defined in the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. And the third point is that we feel as people working behind the preparation of the convention that we need to shift from something that Granada and Malta Convention concentrated on, from object, from heritage as a physical point to the heritage values, which is also something that ICOMOS was quite eager with from the Nara Declaration on. And the fourth important point is, as a result of the development in Balkans in the 90s and other conflicts all around the world, that we need to work more towards the prevention rather than safeguarding heritage after the conflicts. And the last 2 points are related to the new approach to the public authorities and public institutions, to a more open way of seeing that all stakeholders and also rights holders have to have a say in the process from the identification up to the presentation and interpretation of heritage. And last but not least, that heritage is an important factor in the sustainable development of our societies. Next slide, please. So what are the impacts that are important in this regard? I will illustrate it with some examples, really. I'm having the same points, but complemented with the impacts. So horizontal and vertical distribution of responsibilities, as I already explained, heritage authorities and let's say governments have to deal with all complexity of heritage by involving other stakeholders as well. So, for example, I was later on, after the Faro Convention has been adopted, and France never signed and ratified it, but instead of this fact, local authorities in a lot of France gathered together and signed the convention for themselves. That's something a quite important issue. So they they saw that the principles of the Faro Convention were important for their work with the heritage, and the public response was quite positive. If we speak about the second point, so that individuals and communities should exercise the rights to enjoy, sustain, and transmit heritage, I can illustrate it, for example, with the Freiburg Declaration that was really, it is not a legally binding document, but nevertheless, all the heritage rights principles that are expressed in the Faro Convention or in this Freiburg Declaration from 2014 extended to culture itself. And last but not least, Slovenian presidency took the topic of heritage rights to the EU level, and now after the international conference that we held in September, we're now preparing the discussion paper for the next EU Council session, where ministers of culture will discuss this topic and see how to follow up the conclusions of the conference. The third one is the heritage contributes to cultural diversity, human development, and quality of life. This is something that we all strive to express, and also ICOMOS quality principles for Europe witness this wish and this determination. For example, I could also mention the Swedish study from 2014, which was the base for the Sweden to sign the Faro Convention. And if you check it on the web, you see how thoroughly they also discussed this, all these implications of the Faro Convention. Preventive measures and the dialogue deployed in peacekeeping missions is something that EU has taken on board by the conclusions which were received recently. Now, I believe in the beginning of October or not, September or something, on the EU approach to heritage issues in conflict areas. And also Italian government developed tools to promote heritage protection in conflict areas. So public authorities guaranteeing systematic approach to heritage, that is something that also was upgraded by the Council of Europe's strategy, Heritage Strategy 2021 for the 21st century. And Slovenia also adopted a similar strategy in 2019, and rising awareness about heritage as development potential is something that is now on board when we discuss issues related to heritage as a resource for sustainable development, where also ICOMOS is quite active factor. So thank you. That's from my part.
Thank you very much, both of you. And now it is the question time. So, does anybody have any questions? To Ondina, to Benedict, to Jelka on the matters.
Or even we can pass on if anybody has any comments on any of the presentations or any common threads, common points across them. What struck me, I'll just start reading again, but just struck me, obviously Faro, which was our last document, is now 16 years adopted, and all of the other documents we've discussed are new, are about to emerge. And so I suppose the question really is how do we ultimately, how will we test how inspirational they have been in the future? And maybe seeing as we have Benedict, Jelka and Ondina looking at Faro, that is now 16 years practiced, it has reached beyond the Council of Europe states in terms of its influence, and yet many member states have yet to sign and ratify. I know in Ireland we haven't. So I suppose is it more effective to be a non-legal but inspiring, influencing document, or is there a limitation by not being legal? So how do we make these documents inspire? And that's maybe Jelke and Benedict and Andina a few questions there.
Let me start by saying that the Council of Europe and European Commission have signed a program of advertising, let's say, Faro Convention, and we hope that this will also lead to greater ratification from the EU member states. But nevertheless, if you look at the EU documents on heritage, in the preamble, Faro Convention is cited quite often. Benedict can remember when we prepared the text of the convention, we proposed that European Union could also be one of the signing parties, which never took place really in legal terms, but regarding all these activities that are commonly led by the Council of Europe and EU authorities, I believe that it's quite a proof that the principles and the interest behind the Faro Convention are working even without larger legal adoption.
Yes, if I can add to what Jelke said, because it was a long discussion on what type of document could this be. It could, at some point, it was suggested that it would be a declaration rather than a convention, and ultimately it became a framework convention. I'm speaking for myself. I'm absolutely delighted that it has become a framework convention and not another declaration. Am I sorry that there are no more ratifications? I think time has changed. When I was chairing the Cultural Heritage Committee of the Council of Europe, I made this, in fact, all the heritage activities were threatened because there were staff issues and financing issues for activities that the Council of Europe did not consider as its core activity, which is now human rights. And so I made a study on the ratification rate of the heritage conventions. And I realized, to my delight, that the heritage conventions had a high ratification rate, as high, if not higher, than the human rights instruments. And that was a game changer for the Committee of Ministers and the ambassadors, who had to take a decision because they were not aware of the of how popular the Council of Europe conventions were. But as I said, we are now in another time. Bringing your country to a ratification process takes a lot of time. Jelke and others know what it is because we have done that in our respective countries. And my impression is that the focus of our parliaments and our governments is not on ratification, like it was on ratification for past heritage conventions. And that's why it's so fantastic that the civil society took Faro and they ran away with it. And so you don't, I'm happy that it's a legal instrument, but you don't not only need ratifications. It's far more important that it is carried by the civil society and the professionals as well. And as ICOMOS is concerned, of course, ICOMOS cannot deliver binding text, but ICOMOS can be inspirational, and many Council of Europe and UNESCO binding instruments or even recommendations and declarations were based on the work that ICOMOS has done in the past. So ICOMOS should continue to do that, in my opinion. Thank you.
That's a good one. Dina, do you want to take up or respond? Maybe how can the quality principles learn from Faro?
Well, first of all, I would like to take the opportunity and to say my opinion whether the quality principles should be a legally binding document or not. Well, you are putting the finger on a very burning question there, Granny, because when this all started in 2014, the initial request was that these principles become an annex to the regulation of governing all the European funds, funding or impacting cultural heritage. So from the get-go, the request was to have a legally binding framework. Why? Well, for two reasons. First of all, because there was none. So this huge amount of money, because we all the time we complain about the lack of investment in cultural heritage, but if we look only during the last 15 years, there is a tremendous amount of money that was injected directly into the cultural heritage infrastructure in all our countries. Now, I will not go into the why and how this was done because it's a useless discussion at this point, but very soon, I mean, in a few years, the reality started to come in, and we noticed that the projects that were being funded were not, let's just say, examples of best practices in all cases. So then what do you do with this? Because the money kept on pouring. I mean, every 7 years we have a new MFF. What is going on? And the regulation, and I repeat this because this is really the burning question in relation to these quality principles, the regulation of the European Union that governs this funding does not require for compulsory quality principles. It did not in 2007, it did not in 2013, it doesn't in 2021 when we start the new MFF. So in 2014, when we all started to discuss about this, we already had accounts of projects that have gone wrong. And we realized after checking the issue with the relevant services in the European Commission, at the fraud authorities, at the OLAF, in the European Parliament, at the Council, at the Committee of Regions, so all levels of governance that are involved in managing these funds, we realized that there was a loop in the legislation. There is no nice way to say this. There is just a loop in the legislation. There is no provision for this whatsoever. So the only solution that we saw at the time to fix this problem, not to go around the problem and pretend we don't see it, was to have a legally binding document that can clarify things for the heritage side. The process, I explained it in my presentation. Now, this is maybe the ideal version, to have these principles, to have them as annex to the regulation and to consider them as legally binding. Because of lack of political power, this was not possible for the current MFF. We have only this document, which is not legally binding. If you ask me if I can give an example as a reply as a private person, I would definitely say yes, this should be a legally binding document. It can still remain an inspirational document. It will probably redefine our field, but legally speaking, it should be binding. Now, on the other hand, as you say, I worked for 7 years at the core of the machine. I know how this goes. It's not an easy thing to achieve. I think that what we have achieved so far is great, considering the complexity of the issue, considering that there are so many countries with so many different problems. Not all countries have the same problems when it comes to cultural heritage. So I think that so far it is amazing what has been achieved. There was the European Year of Cultural Heritage. There was a flagship initiative dedicated to this. There was an expert working group working on this. And Benedict and Jelka, they were both part of this expert group. So that's why I'm actually very very excited, but at the same time very humble to speak about this in their presence, because they should rather speak about this. They contribute to writing this wonderful document. So my opinion is that yes, it should be legally binding now, because it is a complex and complicated issue. It will probably not be legally binding very soon. But this in no way should prevent all of us from applying it. We are all professionals. We know that what it says in this document is the right thing to do. And I think that we owe it to ourselves, to our profession, and to our countries to promote this document as good as we can.
Thank you, Adina. And I think that's it's a terrific document. It's a great answer, and it puts it. I think there is a hunger for the quality principles, and we've understood again there is a hunger outside the European membership, and it has a relevance more widely. So I think it's our task now to work with others to encouraging its application, and maybe we can come back in 16 years and see how all our other documents we discussed today are continuing, hopefully, to be relevant and positively inspiring. I think perhaps I see Ed Carroll has a comment in the chat as well, and Ed, maybe because I'm conscious of time, if you're very keen to ask, but it's late, so I might just read your comment. I think you agreed civil society has run away with it, which was Benedict's good line. And I think that inspirations really need practices in situ, like Met in Vispri, Hotel du Nord in Marseille, and so on. And you also loved the point about the local authority signing up to FARO well in advance of the state. That's certainly taking power into the local hands. And that was certainly the case in Serbian Republic. Maybe, Rin, should we should move to closing the webinar, and I might pass back to you, Rin, to take us through the last slides and to thank everyone.
Yeah, I'm very grateful also to Ed to make this comment, because he's representing FARO Convention Network, and I think that one of the tasks of this Heritage Thursdays is also to bring people and different networks together to say that we are working for the same goal, and we have certainly a lot of inspiration to enhance this cooperation future.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm very, very grateful to all the participants, both the speakers and the audience. And of course, we are very grateful to the very inspirational team with whom we are making this Heritage Thursdays together. We have 3 coordinators, Alicia Castillo, Adriana Cariaga, and Ave Paulus. And we have a very, very good task team to work on the communications. Special applause to Paulette Vallas, Laura Maric, Angela Kurmi, Valentin Nabalcarle, Deidre McDermott, and we are very grateful to the focal point of our Common Dignity Working Group, Bente Mathisen. And with this, I have small notices what comes next. ICOMOS is going to have its this year scientific symposium dedicated to living heritage and climate change. And it's happening already on the 9th and 10th of November. And it's usually dedicated, open to ICOMOS members. But with this, I would like to encourage everybody in this audience who is not yet the member of the most inspiring international organization, ICOMOS, to become the members. It's very easy. If you feel that you are a heritage expert or heritage-oriented person, contact your national committee, and you will find more information on ICOMOS webpage. And our next Heritage Thursday will come at the end of the next month, the last Thursday of November, and it is dedicated to communities' rights and coastal heritage. So I thank you all for a very inspiring day and hope to see you in 1 month's time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. And thank you very much to our participants, our presenters. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye now.